Hey, hello everyone. So this week we are going to be talking about research questions as well as variables and constructs in the next lecture. So in Bain's chapter 1, they talk about modes of knowing. And so there's a deep dive if you want to know more about that. You can click this link here. There will be a question about modes of knowing from chapter 1 on the activity that's due at the end of this week. So where do research ideas come from? So there's this idea of a continuum of research ideas from informal to formal. So beginning with an idea like, this is interesting, I'd like to know more about it. Moving into, we have a problem to solve, let's figure out the best way to do it. Our earlier project answered some questions, but there are still some questions unanswered. And then the last one, the most formal, let's test this theory. This is what the theory says. Let's see if that's true. How are ideas developed? So the text talks about that McGuire developed a list of strategies to identify research questions. These include exploring everyday behavior, adding to similar problems that have already been studied, challenging a common belief or hypothesis, and then testing a theory. And if any of you remember the show Mythbusters, that was one of the things that they focused on was challenging common beliefs or myths that society has. I think they had one episode about is it safe to take a shower during a thunderstorm? I believe the answer to that was no. They tested that and found that it is indeed quite dangerous. So there are challenges of developing a novel idea for research. The first is that areas of research that are interesting and obvious areas that are obvious to you are also obvious to other people. So they've likely already been explored. It's important to know that the more information that you gather about a specific issue or theory, the more you'll understand what information is missing from the research base. Basically, you don't know what you don't know. And so until you start kind of taking a deep dive into the research base for your topic of interest, you won't know what's been found out already, and you won't know what questions remain. So some of the questions or some of the areas that you can look at when you're going through your literature review are, who are the prevailing researchers in your area of interest? Usually there's a few professors, researchers that put out a lot of information on a particular topic. You can ask yourself, what questions have they explored already? What questions have they answered? And what remains unanswered? One of the things that's helpful is looking at discussion sections of research articles because there's often space that's taken to talk about, additional areas or areas for additional research, as well as limitations. So newer research could address some of the limitations of a previous study. So the chapter also talks about the importance of culture in research. It's important to know that findings from the research have been historically based in Western populations, so the United States, Australia, Canada, Eastern Europe. And what the answers that we have found to questions are not necessarily universal. So we know that culture has an impact on human behavior and on psychology. We can't assume that studies that are conducted here in the United States apply to populations from China, different tribes in Africa, people from the Ukraine, etc. So this is an emerging area of research. And one thing that I notice in the work that I do, we administer a lot of tests, so psychological tests, and it's challenging to find tests that are that basically work with populations who are non-English speaking, for example, or folks who are new to the United States or have moved here from another country or come from a completely different culture. So it's important to look at what populations were used to develop measures. So what populations on which it was normed is kind of how we say it. So there's also talk about the use of the internet in research. So this has been kind of an up and coming thing as technology advances. A lot of research is conducted virtually. You'll see a lot of graduate dissertations. One of the kind of logistically easy ways to conduct research is to do survey research on the internet. There are pros and cons to this method. So as you can imagine, the internet's going to reach more people. It's going to have a far reach. It's going to be more broad. There'll be less geographic restrictions because you're not recruiting for people right here in the community in Columbia. It's usually lower cost. There's less logistical challenges like trying to schedule things, being there on site while the person is undergoing whatever measures you're administering or undergoing whatever they need to do to participate in the research. There's also an immediate response, and usually that data that's collected we can think that that's pretty accurate. So it kind of takes out the human error of having to transfer scores over into a spreadsheet, having to count up scores. So doing like math, it kind of removes that human error component. There's also less burden on the participants. So they don't have to mail back like a mail-in survey. They don't have to show up somewhere. They can do the survey or whatever it is, the activity in their pajamas if they'd like to. But there are also some downsides to internet research. So one of the issues that is talked about is that samples can be not as representative. So we know that younger people, students particularly, are more receptive to online surveys. There's also a service called Amazon Mechanical Turk. This is used from time to time in dissertation research, but essentially Amazon pays people to participate in research. So the researcher does have to, it's not a free option. The researcher has to provide money to Amazon to make this happen. But you can think about like, who's going to participate in research like this? Someone who needs maybe a little extra money on the side. So, is that representative of, the whole population? If you're only targeting people who are using this specific service. You also have a potential loss of data quality when you're conducting research through the internet. You're not able to verify that the person who's filling out the survey or who finished the survey is the same person who started the survey, for example. People may be more reluctant to finish a survey if it takes longer than they expected or if they're interrupted by something. And then, of course, there's actual lower response rates as compared with mail-in surveys. So replication in research is important. Replication is basically the process of verifying prior findings by conducting similar research. So there's different ways of doing this. There's exact replication, which is using the same or trying to answer the same question with the same approach. There's replication by extension, which is the same question, but the researcher is adding something new. There's conceptual replication, so it's the same question, but using a different approach. Replication in general helps parse out potential issues with reliability and validity. So the chapter talks about, and these are good terms to know. So type 1 errors are when we're seeing a connection in the data that does not actually exist. So a connection between two variables, it's not actually there. And then a type 2 error would be missing a connection that does actually exist between the two variables. So repeating the study using different methods by different researchers can help to kind of bolster the evidence-based support for a certain treatment or a certain theory. Just a helpful visual to help remember validity and reliability. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into statistics too, but I really love this visual. I think it's really helpful for me to look at to remind myself, but essentially the last image there on the right is what we're hoping to get from research and replicating research. So as a real world example, the American Psychological Association has a division 12, and this division focuses on evidence-based interventions. So they have a database where you can search by a diagnosis or a condition or a treatment modality. And they kind of rate how much research support there is for a certain intervention for a certain diagnosis. So for example, dialectical behavior therapy for people with borderline personality disorder. That has good research support. There's been a lot of studies that have been conducted on that. And so they have this database. Check it out. It's really interesting if you're ever curious, if you hear about an intervention and you're curious how much actual research has been done about it. It can be really insightful. So why are there not more replication studies? So first, it's not very exciting. Journals are not motivated to publish findings that are not new, and researchers are not motivated to redo an experiment. Professors are also not motivated are motivated to produce new and original research that provides new findings to the field. There might be some pressure too that they experience if they're out of university and have to be putting out research. They may be getting some, external pressures as well. Also, funding for replication is sometimes limited. So grant funding to try to get money to conduct the research, that can be difficult. And there may not be enough information provided by original researchers to accurately replicate the study. So the Baines chapter, pages 91 through 94, provides some helpful tips on how to make the most of database searches and how to conduct a literature review, as well as how to read a research article. There's also a literature search handout that's listed under the module for this week as well for you to review. There's the question I think that always comes up about to Google or not to Google. I've used Google Scholar. I think it is more sensitive to some of the search terminology that you might use, which can be beneficial. It can be frustrating if you're trying to find certain terms on EBSCOhost or looking through certain journals. It's not always very sensitive to or responsive to what you're trying to look for. I recommend using Google Scholar. And then any articles that you find that are interesting and you don't have access to through the internet, you can go to the library, see if we have access here through the library, or request an interlibrary loan. And so I'm sure the Learning Commons can help answer more questions about that if that comes up. One of the other things that you can do is read article introductions. So often there'll be prior research that's cited, original and primary sources that you can go back, you can go through the references and find these original articles. Avoid using as cited in. So ideally you are finding the primary original research about this construct or this issue. If you take information that someone has already put together in an introduction section, it's not going to be the whole picture necessarily, and it's going to be filtered through the researcher's perspective and their purpose for including that information. So you really want to try to find original sources as often as you can. All right, so your task is to begin brainstorming a topic for your lit review final. So start thinking about a topic that's interesting to you. Start thinking about your variables of interest, and we will talk about that more in the next lecture. Thanks.